Dara Weston was 39 years old the evening. A woman she had never met opened her own front door, pointed a handgun at her chest, and said she had no right to be there. She had every right to be there. It was her house. She had bought it herself, with her own money, 4 years before she married the man the woman was standing inside of. To everyone who knew them, Dara was the quiet wife. She worked as a security consultant for a private firm in Charlotte, which was true as far as it went, and which is the kind of job description that most people accept without a follow-up question, and which Dara had always found useful for that reason. She wore reading glasses for close work and preferred flat shoes, and drove a navy blue sedan that she had owned for 6 years and kept in precise mechanical condition. Her husband, Marcus Weston, was an orthopedic surgeon with a large practice, a confident manner, and a woman named Kristen Lowe, who had apparently decided, on a Thursday evening in November, that showing up at the house with a firearm was the appropriate way to resolve a situation that Marcus had apparently been managing poorly for quite some time. Kristen Lowe was a 34-year-old pharmaceutical sales representative with a leased luxury vehicle and enough confidence to make very bad decisions without hesitating. She raised the gun. She said the house would be hers soon enough, and that Dara should leave. Dara looked at the gun for exactly 2 seconds. What happened in the next 7 seconds was controlled, necessary, and left Kristen Lowe sitting on the floor of the entryway with the firearm secured and her wrist at an angle that made continuing the conversation impractical. Dara had served 12 years in the United States Navy, the last 6 of them as a SEAL. She had been in rooms considerably less comfortable than her own entryway and had made faster decisions than this one with considerably higher stakes on the other side of them. What Marcus did not know, and what Kristen Lowe had not known before that evening, was what 12 years of that service had produced in the woman they had both underestimated so completely. What came next settled the matter permanently. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The early morning in Dara's house was a particular kind of quiet that she had cultivated deliberately. She was up before 5, which was habit so deeply ingrained she no longer thought of it as a choice, and the first hour belonged to her in a way that no other hour in the day did. She made coffee in the kitchen she had renovated herself the previous summer, replacing the cabinet hardware and refinishing the floors and repainting the walls the exact shade of gray-green she had decided on after looking at paint chips for 2 weeks, with the methodical patience she brought to every decision that would have to live with for a long time. The work was precise, and it was hers, and she had enjoyed every hour of it. She was a security consultant. She had been one, in the civilian sense, for 6 years since her separation from the Navy, and she was good at it with the particular fluency of someone who had spent 12 years living inside the discipline the work required before being asked to teach it to others. Her firm contracted with corporate clients to assess physical security vulnerabilities, train personnel, and design protective protocols, and she was, in the quiet, unremarkable way that competence presents when it has nothing to prove, very good at it. She made $340,000 a year. She kept a low profile at the firm's client events and let her reports do the speaking, which they did clearly. Her father had served in the Army before she was born, 20 years of it, and had come home to Charlotte and built a landscaping business and raised Dara and her brother in a house on the south side of the city with the same disciplined, quiet attention he had brought to everything since the service. He had died 5 years ago. She thought about him often, specifically about the way he worked, which was never rushed and never wasted emotion, and always produced exactly what the job required. He had told her once, when she was 8 years old and watching him trim a hedge with a pair of hand shears that seemed absurdly slow compared to the electric trimmer hanging on the shed wall, "Baby, the slow tool teaches you things the fast one doesn't. Use the shears. Feel where the hedge wants to go. She had stood beside him for an hour that morning watching him work. She had never forgotten it. She kept his shears in the garage on a hook beside her own. She used them every spring on the boxwood along the front walk. She had met Marcus at a professional conference in her second year of consulting, a security and risk management summit in Raleigh, at which he had been presenting a session on hospital security protocols from a clinical administrator's perspective. He was organized and articulate, and had a quality of focused attention in conversation that she had found. At 33 and after 12 years of working entirely in male-dominated environments, genuinely refreshing. They had dated for 2 years before she agreed to marry him. Not because she was uncertain, but because she had learned in the Navy that decisions made in the first rush of a feeling were rarely the best ones, and that patience in assessment produced better outcomes than speed. She had assessed Marcus for 2 years and found him sound. She had been wrong about the soundness, not about all of it, but about enough. The thing she noticed first was a change in the quality of his attention. Marcus had always been a man who was present when he was home, not demonstratively but genuinely, asking about her work and listening to the answers and engaging with what she told him as though it interested him. That quality had begun to thin, gradually and then more noticeably, in the 18 months before the Thursday in November. He was present in the house, but his attention was somewhere else, and she could feel the difference the way she could feel the difference between a building with a structural problem and one without, not always visible from the outside, but unmistakably real once you knew what to look for. The incoming signal had been, of all things, a parking validation stub. She had found it in the outer pocket of his briefcase when she was retrieving a pen, a stamped parking receipt from a restaurant in the South End she had never been to with him, dated on an evening when he had told her he was working late at the practice. She photographed it with her phone and placed it back in the pocket where she had found it, and she went upstairs and made a note in the document she kept for things that needed more information before they had a place to go. When you moved too early, you got a lie. When you waited, you got the truth. She did not move too early. She had not been looking for anything when she returned home 2 Thursdays later, 40 minutes ahead of her expected schedule because a client meeting had ended early. She had not been looking for anything when she came through the front gate and saw, parked in the driveway of the house she owned, a car she did not recognize, a silver luxury sedan with a rental agency sticker on the rear bumper. She walked to the front door. She put her key in the lock. The door opened before she turned the key. What she found on the other side of that door, and what she understood in the seconds that followed, was the complete picture of what had been taking shape in the 18 months she had been watching. The picture was not complicated. It was simply, as most important truths are, a great deal more specific than she had wanted it to be. Kristen Lowe was standing in the entryway of Dara's house, with the particular posture of a woman who had been told she belonged there and had chosen to believe it. She was dressed as though she had been somewhere, or was about to go somewhere. Her expression moved when Dara opened the door from surprise to a kind of defiant composure that had been clearly rehearsed. Then she reached into the bag hanging from her shoulder and produced the gun. Her hands were not steady. Her voice was not steady. She said words that were designed to establish a position of power in a room where she had no power at all. Dara looked at the gun. She took 2 seconds to assess. Not because she needed 2 seconds, but because she had been trained to be precise rather than reactive. And precision sometimes looked like stillness from the outside when it was actually something else entirely. Then she moved. It was brief. It was controlled. It was not violent in any meaningful sense of the word, which is to say nothing was broken and no one was unconscious, and the whole sequence took less time than it takes to say a sentence of average length. The firearm was secured. Kristen Lowe was seated on the entryway floor with the expression of someone who has attempted to use a tool without understanding what it was and has just been given a thorough education in that misunderstanding. Dara set the secured firearm on the hall table. She looked at Kristen Lowe without anger and without satisfaction. She said, "Wait here." She walked upstairs, changed her shoes, and came back down. She called the non-emergency police line from the kitchen and reported the situation in the precise, unhurried language of a person who had filed incident reports before and knew what the form required. Then she sat in the kitchen and drank a glass of water and waited for the officer to arrive. Her hands did not shake. Her face remained perfectly calm. She was done with the physical portion of this situation. She had more important work to do. She made one call before the officer arrived. She said, "Felicia, I need you tomorrow morning, first thing." The entryway tile was cold and hard, and Kristen Lowe sat on it for 22 minutes. Some things require force. The rest requires documentation. Felicia Quarles had practiced family law in Charlotte for 19 years, and she had the compact, organized manner of someone who had developed, through long practice, the ability to review a complicated situation and identify its essential moving parts faster than most people could list the surface details. She arrived at her office the following morning to find Dara already seated in the waiting area with a folder on her lap, and the stillness of a woman who had been patient before and would be patient again for as long as the situation required. She reviewed the parking receipt photograph first. Then, the bank statements Dara had printed, a summary she had compiled over the previous 3 months by reviewing their joint account with the same systematic attention she applied to facility security audits, looking not for anything specific, but for patterns that should not be there. She had found $38,000 in discretionary charges over 16 months that corresponded to no household expense she could identify. Restaurant charges, hotel reservations, 2 airline tickets to destinations she had not traveled to, a piece of jewelry from a store she had never visited. She had documented each one with dates and amounts and the merchant category codes from the statements, building a timeline the way she built every assessment, from the available evidence outward, without assumption. Felicia reviewed the timeline document for 11 minutes. Then she said, "The joint account charges represent marital waste under North Carolina law, which affects the equitable distribution calculation in your favor." She set the page down. What happened last night with the firearm is a separate matter, but it is not an unrelated one. A woman entering a marital home with a weapon during an active extramarital relationship creates civil exposure for your husband if her presence there was facilitated by him. Dara said, "He gave her a key." Felicia said, "You know this?" Dara said, "She used a key to open the door before I could use mine. I own the only other key to that lock." Felicia looked at her. She said, "That connects him to the incident directly." She said it the way a person states a measurement, precisely, without editorial. 2 days later, Dara drove to her Uncle Raymond's house in Huntersville, a property on a quiet road with a long gravel drive and a garden that Raymond had been expanding for 30 years, and which now occupied most of the backyard in a design that was purely functional. Tomatoes and beans and squash and the herbs he used in the cooking that he had learned from Dara's grandmother, and that he performed with the same unhurried care. He was in the garden when she arrived. He had been expecting her. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the row of staked tomato plants beside him. He said, "Your father would have been very calm about this." She said, "I know. I was." He said, "I mean about all of it, not just the woman. The whole of it. He paused. He used to say that the slow tool teaches you things the fast one doesn't. He meant that about service too. That the situations that require you to wait and observe produce better outcomes than the ones where you act on the first information. She had said the same sentence to herself the morning after the Thursday, standing at the kitchen counter with her coffee, looking at the folder on the table. Raymond said, "You have what you need?" She said, "I have everything." He pulled a steak tomato from his jacket pocket that he had apparently been carrying and handed it across. It was the first of the season, red and small and warm from wherever he had been keeping it. He said, "Your father grew the same variety. They do better when you're patient with them." She drove back to Charlotte and went to the office and spent the remainder of the week doing the work she was paid to do. Reviewing a security assessment for a medical campus client and preparing a personnel training proposal for a financial firm downtown. She was thorough and she was precise, and her clients found her work reliable, which was the quality she had always valued most in any professional relationship. Marcus was at the house in the evenings. She made dinner on Wednesday and asked about his day and listened to the answer and cleared the plates and went to bed without telling him anything of what was in motion, because there was nothing to be gained by telling him yet, and because the work was not finished. He was performing for an audience that had already moved past the performance. By the following Friday, Felicia had surfaced the counter-evidence that completed the picture. Kristen Lowe had been charged with criminal threatening and unlawful possession of a firearm in a dwelling, both misdemeanors under the relevant statutes, based on the police report from the Thursday incident. Her attorney had reached out to Felicia's office the previous day to discuss settlement of the civil component of the claim, which Felicia had declined to discuss until the divorce proceedings were further along, because the timing of the settlement served Dara's interests better that way. The firearm, Felicia's investigator confirmed, had been purchased by Kristen Lowe legally. It had also been transported across state lines in a manner that created a federal documentation question that the investigator had referred to the appropriate authority for review. This was not something Dara had sought or arranged. It was simply the consequence of what Kristen Lowe had chosen to bring into a situation she had not understood. Marcus's financial exposure had also grown. A review of his practice's billing records, obtained through the discovery process, identified 16 months of personal charges submitted through the practice's business account under an expense category labeled professional development. They corresponded to none of the conferences or training programs in the practice's official records. The amounts ranged from several $100s to several thousand per charge. The total was $67,000. His practice manager had flagged the pattern 6 months earlier, according to records Felicia's team subpoenaed, and had been told by Marcus that the charges were being reviewed. They had not been reviewed. Dara added the billing records to the folder. She noted the $67,000 figure the way she noted any security vulnerability in an assessment report. Clearly, without excess language, as a fact that required a response and would receive one. Real power operated in quiet rooms. This one had always been hers. The meeting took place at Felicia's conference room on a Tuesday morning in January. Marcus arrived with his attorney, a litigation partner at a large Charlotte firm who had spent the previous 2 weeks reviewing materials that had apparently surprised him in their comprehensiveness. Marcus had the posture of a man who had prepared for a different kind of meeting and was recalibrating in real time. Dara sat across the table from him with the same stillness she had brought to every professional environment she had ever occupied. The stillness that people who did not know her sometimes mistook for passivity, and that was in fact the product of 12 years of training in the specific discipline of being more prepared than whoever was across from you. Felicia placed the joint account timeline on the table. 16 months. $38,000. Each charge documented, dated, and categorized. She placed the practice billing records behind it. $67,000 in personal charges submitted through the practice's business account. The practice manager's flagged report. The 16 months of no review. She placed the incident report from the Thursday evening behind that. Kristen Lowe's entry into the marital home using a key. The firearm. The sequence of events. The charges filed. She placed, last, a single page. It listed Dara's professional background, 12 years of United States Navy service, the last 6 as a SEAL, her separation date, her transition to private security consulting, her current position and compensation. Marcus looked at the last page for a long moment. He said, "I didn't know." Felicia said, "Which part?" He did not answer immediately. His attorney placed a hand briefly on his arm. Marcus said, "To Dara, not to Felicia, about your service." The full extent of it. She looked at him with the steady, unhurried attention she had always brought to assessments that required accuracy rather than speed. She said, "You never asked." "I answered what you asked, and you asked what was convenient for you to hear." She kept her hand still on the table. "That is a pattern I recognized early and chose to believe would change. I was wrong about that. The assessment is mine to own." She paused. "The rest is yours." She placed the settlement terms in front of his attorney. The terms were precise: full accounting and equitable return of the $38,000 in documented marital waste, with interest, full restitution of the $67,000 in fraudulent practice charges, which were a matter of record and would be referred to the state medical board as a condition of any settlement that did not include voluntary disclosure. The marital home, purchased by Dara before the marriage and titled in her name throughout, was hers entirely and uncontested. The joint account balance was to be divided equitably per statute after the waste deductions. A protective order against Kristen Lowe, already filed and granted, would remain in effect for the duration of the civil proceedings, which were separate and also in motion. His attorney reviewed the terms for 8 minutes. He spoke to Marcus quietly. Marcus read the page himself. He set it down. He said, "Dara," she said, "Felicia will handle any further questions." She stood, gathered her portfolio, and walked out of the conference room and down the hall and through the building's lobby and out into a January morning that was cold and clear, and asked nothing of her that she had not already given to situations considerably more demanding than this one. She drove home. She stood for a moment in the entryway of her house, which was quiet and entirely hers, and looked at the floor where Kristen Lowe had sat, which was clean and ordinary, and contained no residue of anything that had happened on a Thursday evening 3 months prior. She had refinished those floors herself. They looked exactly as she had intended them to look. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table and opened the security assessment she had been working on before all of this had required her attention, and she resumed it where she had left off, because the work did not wait, and she had always found that the work was the most reliable measure of where she actually was. 9 months later, Dara stood in the garden beside Raymond's house in Huntersville on a Saturday morning in October, pressing the last of a row of garlic cloves into the turned soil with the methodical patience the planting required. Raymond was a few rows over doing the same, neither of them speaking, which was the particular comfort of working alongside someone who had known you long enough that silence was not a gap to fill, but a texture of its own. Her firm had, in the 9 months since the settlement, promoted her to lead partner on a federal facility assessment contract that represented the largest engagement in the firm's history. The work was significant, and she was suited to it, and she had accepted the additional responsibility with the same quiet attention she brought to everything she believed was worth doing correctly. The compensation was commensurate. She had heard, through a former colleague who remained connected to Charlotte's medical community, that Marcus's practice had been reviewed by the state medical board following the financial disclosure the settlement had required. The review was ongoing. 2 of his hospital privileges had been suspended pending the outcome. His practice had lost its 2 largest insurance contracts, which had significantly affected its operational capacity. He had moved into a rental apartment in the university area. Kristen Lowe's criminal charges had resulted in a plea agreement that included a suspended sentence and a prohibition on firearm ownership for 5 years. The federal documentation matter had been resolved with a fine. She had relocated to Raleigh. Marcus's mother had called Dara twice in the spring. The calls were brief and gracious and asked nothing except to know that Dara was well, which she was, and which she said so plainly because it was true. Darius Kent was a federal security contractor she had met during the facility assessment work, a former Army Ranger who had transitioned into the same professional orbit she occupied, and who had the unhurried, measured quality of someone who had learned to be accurate rather than impressive. He had asked her to dinner by saying simply that he had enjoyed working with someone who was better prepared than anyone else in the room, and would like to know more about how she had gotten there. She had found the precision of the question impossible to decline. They had dinner, and then more dinners, and she had found, in his company, the particular ease of someone who required no explanation and offered none in return except the kind that was actually earned. She pressed the last garlic clove into the soil and covered it with both palms and stood. Raymond looked over and said, "Those'll be ready in spring." She said, "I know." He said, "Your father always said garlic needed to be in the ground before the first frost, patient enough to wait through the winter. That's what makes it strong." She looked at the turned row of soil, which was dark and even, and held no sign of what was buried in it. In spring it would be different. The work had been done correctly. The rest was simply time. She was free. She was solvent. She was unbothered. The slow tool teaches you things the fast one doesn't. She had known that since she was 8 years old, standing in the yard beside her father, watching him work. She had never forgotten it. She had never needed to. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.